Hello and welcome to Game and Read. I'm Peter.
And I'm Erin.
And we are here to do our book and game discussion for this week. We will be talking about Murderous Masquerades. We will be talking about the Sexy Brutale, the video game by Cavalier Game Studios and Tequila Works, along with the book, The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton.
On this episode, we are going into a deep dive of the game and the book separately. Next week is when we will talk about them together. So today we will keep them separate. We'll exhaust all the conversation about each one, what we liked, what we didn't like, the intricacies and plot twists.
We're going to be starting off with the game this week. So, Erin, tell me more about your thoughts on the Sexy Brutale. Now that we've played all of it, and we finished it a while back, so we're going to be trying to rack our brains here for some of the things that we went through, because it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, actually, when we finished it. And what are your first takeaways from this game?
I really, really enjoyed this game.
Mm-hmm.
I like puzzles a lot. I like this mystery aspect. And the aesthetics of the game are fantastic. It's very, I think I mentioned this in our intro episode, but it's very like Moulin Rouge-y. It's just like opulent casino, but in a classy way.
Well, and the premise is that it is a old manor that this main character turned into a casino. Well, I guess the main antagonist / main impetus for everything that's going on turned into a casino.
I think you compared it to Monaco,
Monaco, the small principality in, Southern Europe.
And I haven't been to Monaco, but I feel like that's an accurate description.
It probably isn't all that accurate, but I don't know for certain. But I think it is more in line with that than what we were getting on with our introduction, in that it is not a American-style casino, which is often more of a big business type thing and less of a aristocratic, fancy party kind of thing. This is more like a fancy parlor with gambling in it rather than a large business operating for anybody to come in.
The game is great, I think, because it throws you in with basically no information. And while usually that really bothers me, I really like knowing what is going on. I like some framework. I think that is one of the strengths of this game, and part of why I enjoyed it so very much was that you really figure things out as you go along. You unlock secrets, you discover new aspects of the manor, you get bits and pieces of the story, so you can start to piece things together. And I think that that's a really interesting way to weave story into this interactive puzzle game. It's not quite it's sort of an adventure game, like a little point and clicky.
I would say it comes down to a point-and-click adventure with specific timing. So a lot of point-and-click adventure games don't, at least in the more traditional, like old PC and Mac sense of the late 80s, early 90s, your Monkey Islands, your Maniac Mansions. Timing is an element in those, especially in, say, I believe Maniac Mansion, whether or not you're at the right place at the right time will affect things. But this one is much more about timing while maintaining that adventure game feel. You're only interacting with so many things. Only so many things are going to be beneficial to what you're doing, and you only have so many verbs you can do in the game. It's not an open concept at all. You can't choose to do a lot of extra things to any particular item, but it is kind of a point-and-click adventure built around this timing thing, where there's a set schedule of what happens at what time, where the characters will be, and you need to make changes to what happens before those events take place.
I found the aspect of time both fascinating and delightful and stressful as hell. It was like, when you knew that something was coming up, whether it was a death you were trying to prevent or the end of the day, and you were rushing around trying to get things done, it was like heightened anxiety, even though like it wasn't a huge consequence, but you lost your progress. I think the timing aspect is not going to be for everyone. I think that's a pretty unique and potentially polarizing aspect of this game.
What do you see it as what makes it a deterrent in your case rather than just a benefit?
The timing?
Yeah.
Well, because I think it can be really frustrating. That's something I found, is that it was frustrating when you didn't quite know what to do. And in the game, there are these clocks, and that's what you sync your pocket watch to. And that's essentially your spawn point.
Yeah, it creates your spawn point for when you restart the day over. And it allows you to, if you say roll back the time, that's where you'll start. If the day ends, that's where you'll start. And so picking the correct spot for what you're dealing with is really important. But was that the issue, or?
That caused a lot of stress for me personally. Okay. I think not so much in the beginning, but once we got deeper in and we had so much of the manor unlocked, because you unlock sort of different wings with each murder or murders that you're preventing. And so as our map grew, and when we were unsure about what we were doing, the clocks and figuring out where do I need to make it to, how do I remember how to get to that clock that I need to sync to, while also avoiding the staff and other characters, because you can't be in the same room as the staff and other characters, just added this really stressful aspect. And most of the time it was it was like a normal game stress of just like, oh, this is a game. You have to be on top of it. But there were a few times, I feel like, especially in like the latter third of the game, that I was just like getting so frustrated and fed up with this timing. I was like, oh, can we please just like have another hour? Can I pause time? Can I just get a little more so I can figure out where the hell I'm going and what I'm doing?
Well, to that, I think what you're referring to is the puzzle that probably gave us the most individual trouble that we had to go through several times, even once we knew what we had to do, which was the Midas and Thanos puzzle. It's one of the last ones you do. They're the two last guests you have to prevent the murder of, and what you have to do is go from effectively one side of the mansion to the other, changing certain things along the way, and you need to know the order in which to change them to make sure that they are in the right spot before the thing that would kill them occurs. And I think the thing that was frustrating with that is just that it was a more spread out puzzle than any of the other ones. And we were able to figure out what to do. We were able to devise, like, how do we get the information? How do we know what to do? How do we find the things we need to affect the kind of these slot machines that we're changing across the building? But it was just a matter of, I'm not just looking at 3 rooms here. I'm looking at 6 to 7 rooms that I'm crossing through. And then they add this kind of time gate where you can only affect this one particular area starting at like 5 o'clock, giving you only 6 hours in game time, which isn't very much to get across. I think the single day goes through in 5 or 10 minutes. It's really not a huge amount of time for you to get around through to everything. So it's a matter of getting to the right place at the right time. And that was frustrating on that end. But I think that was more of an individual puzzle issue rather than something I saw consistently throughout the game.
That's fair. I think part of my stress is just games stress me out sometimes. You know this.
This is just an Aaron problem.
This is just an Aaron problem. I think I mentioned this on our fall games and books episode, but when we played Resident Evil, I threw a controller across the room.
You did. I got pretty mad at you.
So like these guys have things stress me out. So maybe this is a me problem, but if you get easily stressed out by a ticking time, just be warned.
Yeah, if you have a very specific anxiety about time continuing to go and things happening in an order. Mind you, you have the full ability to just repeat things as many times as you want. You do. This may not be the best game for your particular proclivities, but I didn't find it to be, once you get used to it, and I was surprised that we got used to it fairly quickly, I didn't find it too detrimental to my experience.
We already mentioned one of the puzzles, the last one, Thanos and Orem, but what did you think of the puzzles overall? There was a puzzle associated with each murder or set of murders we had to prevent. So I think there were 6 or 7 puzzles maybe in all before we even got to the end game situation.
Yes, I believe it was kind of 7 total, and there were a couple that you solved at the same time, and so those kind of were a conjoined singular puzzle. I would say ones that I found especially interesting were the Willow Blue one. I know was one that frustrated us at a point, but once you were able to figure out what you could do, it was a pretty interesting puzzle, because in this particular puzzle, I guess minor content warning with regards to murder, death, and self-harm / suicide. The interesting thing with the Willow Blue case is that when you track her down and you see the moment where she dies, because that's always the first thing we did, was we went to the scene of the death and figured out at least how are they being killed? Are they being shot? Is there a poison? Is there a giant spider that comes and eats them? Willow Blue is interesting because she commits suicide. She hangs herself in the bell tower from the rope of the grand bell in the bell tower.
Well, and you hear these different noises every single time as you're playing. And so you hear the ringing of the bell at whatever time, I think it's 10 or 11. And it's sort of haunting when you've been hearing that noise as you're solving these other puzzles, and then you finally see it and hear it. It's a pretty haunting experience.
Right. And then the interesting thing with that is that I think they paint her as a bit of a depressive and a tormented artist. And then what actually ends up pushing her over the edge to this is she has a fight with her friend Tequila Bell, who is a singer. And then she gets hypnotized by a evil monster fish.
It's sort of like
a voodoo fish?
Voodoo lamprey piranha situation.
Yeah, well, not a lamprey, a anglerfish.
That's right.
Yeah, lampreys are like the sucker mouth ones. Anglerfish are the ones with the little, doodly lure.
That's right. There is a lamprey in this game, too, involved.
Yes, and the way you end up getting into the room where you see this fish that hypnotizes her and put an end to it is that you take a totem and suck the souls out of a couple other fish in the area, which, when you know how to get to that information, is not that difficult of a thing to do. We had an issue in that some of the ways to open information were not properly explained in the menus, and so we spent several days trying to figure out how do we get into this room? It's locked up. We know we have this totem. How do we activate the totem? And then the answer is, hold the totem up to a fish. It sucks the life force out of a fish, and that'll open the door for you. And we're like, how do we know that? And we had to open the map, and then suddenly it's highlighted on the map, but we had to expand it. We didn't know we could expand it, and it was like, suck the life out of this fish and this fish. And it just felt a little artless at that point, where there wasn't an in-game hint. It was in the menu. There wasn't a sign somewhere being like, this totem, when combined with the power of animal sacrifices, would open a gateway or something like that. Just something a little bit more thematic or in-game for that scenario. So that was one that, while I thought it was an interesting puzzle and that you're solving a suicide, had its own issues with that.
I agree. I think that is probably the most interesting death because it is a suicide. The one that I really enjoyed was Tequila Bell. That's Willow Blue's friend, and she's this wonderful sort of operatic singer.
She's kind of like a fancy lounge singer, but she sings kind of fun, blue music where I'm going to put it in here somewhere, but it's a very kind of somber song, and I think it's the only one with actual lyrics in this game. And we haven't even gotten to the music yet, but it is a very good song, and I think very fitting for the game. But she is kind of a fancy lounge singer.
And her death and that mystery is interesting to me, and I really enjoyed it because this whole idea is that she's going to put on this concert, and her regular pianist, who's another person that you have to save at some point,
is her pianist? I don't think there's a pianist in here.
Red Rockridge?
Clay Rockridge is the muscle.
Right? Red Rockridge is one of the guys.
Oh, yeah, you are totally right. I never put that together in there.
Yeah. So Tequila Belle, she is rehearsing, and one of the staff, I think we mentioned it in the intro, but the staff are the ones that are like,
yes,
are enabling, except with Willow Blue, to some extent, the staff are enabling / committing the murders. So Red Rockridge, who's someone else you have to save at some point, he's the regular accompanist for Tequila Belle, but he is unavailable. And so one of the staff comes and accompanies her and plays this song that she wasn't expecting. And it's this haunting, sort of sad song with lyrics. And the thing about Tequila Belle is that she can hit a note that causes glass to shatter, which is a power you eventually get once you solve her. But she is practicing this song, and the staff accompanist sort of makes her hit that note and then shatters the glass, which then like cuts her throat and kills her. And it's not the most like creative death, but for me it was one of the most visually stunning, which sort of feels like an odd descriptive, but it was this beautiful stained glass window behind her. She's this very sort of made up blonde, big dress, butterfly-y mask, like very Southern Belle sort of style. And she's singing, and it's just a very interesting and I think notable visual image.
Well, and I think the thing that really ties it together is that when you watch her death, the sequence that leads to it, it's a 2-minute long song. If you are, sitting in the other room looking through people, or you're in one of the kind of hidey spots in that built room where they can't see you, you have to literally sit through a 2-minute long song, and then you see her die. And so just kind of repeating that over and over, like most of the deaths have a bit of a long build up to them, of at least, 30 seconds or so. It's kind of a long play because this game's all about the timing. Nothing is slow paced in that, or quick paced in that way, but hers is distinct in that you have to listen to a full performance, and then she dies at the end of it where she hits this high note. So that, I think that's what really separates it from some of the other ones. It's not a conversation leading up to the end. It's not just her walking and then committing suicide. It is a full on performance that has this calamitous end, and then this, snide servant pianist guy, being like, haha, and now you're dead forever. Cutting back over to gameplay, every time you end up saving a guest from their fate, you adopt a power from their own specialty, their own special unique power. This starts off with Sixpence, who is the famous clockmaker of this mansion and casino, and he is the one who gives you the pocket watch ability, which allows you to sync up with the grandfather clocks around the house, as well as sync back to the beginning or midway point through the day. And then as you go and save more people, you adapt and learn different things. You get a lighter that allows you to conduct seances and summon the ghosts that live in the mansion. You get Tequila Belle's ability to break glass with your voice.
You get Trinity Carrington, who's another one that you save. She has impeccable hearing. So with her, saving her, you get sort of this long range, hear whispers, hear where people are in conversations that are happening.
And the reason she has impeccable hearing, because everything's tied into the characters, is that she is a blind woman who is also a great artist and a sculptor of that. So you see her work throughout the mansion, and I really think that they tie this together in that throughout the mansion you can see the footprints of all these different characters who spent a lot of time at the manor just hanging out and having all these grand parties. You see all the aspects of that. You see the theater for Tequila Bell. You see the art studio for Willow Blue. You see all the sculptures created by Trinity and the casino that is guarded over by the other Rockridge, Clay, who is the the head of security with that. And it's just interesting to see all those little bits and pieces from the characters in the building itself.
I love the gaining powers as you save people aspect, because it doesn't unlock this massive new chunk, but it gives you the ability to get deeper into this setting that you've already explored. Maybe there's a room you are in that has a locked chest, and so you need to use
Grayson,
and he can, pick every lock or whatever. I think he's like a master.
He's an escape artist and locksmith.
And so you can pick the locks and you discover either playing cards, which is the collectible in this game because it's a casino. So of course. So you either get playing cards or maybe you unlock a hatch to a different access point. And it's just a really nice way to give you more abilities without it feeling like this definitive next chapter. It's more about exploring the environment more and more deeply as you get more information as you save people.
Moving over to plot and the whole premise of the game, we haven't really touched on it. We've kind of set up the scenario you're in, the characters you're dealing with. Why are we here? We are here to solve all these murders and figure out what's going on in this mansion. You wake up, not sure who you are. You seem to be an older man, kind of dressed in a priest's costume with a white mask with a red handprint on it. And that's given to you by this bloody red woman specter who wants you to change what's going on and save everybody and save yourself and figure out what's going on in the mansion. And then as you move through it, you discover that this is not a concurrent event. This is not something happening in the present moment. It takes a while to get to that. That's right up towards the end there. But you realize that everything happening in the mansion is not in its own reality. It is kind of in this separate pocket reality within the mind of the main protagonist. Up until the end point, you are solving these murders. You're going pretty straightforward through it. It seems like it's building to something, but it doesn't necessarily seem like anything extraordinarily out of the ordinary. Obviously, there's magic going on. You're able to turn back time, and you're trying to affect what's going on. You're trying to figure out why these staff are murdering all of the guests.
And after you solve those 7 murders, you go through this puzzle to unlock this sort of skull room. And behind the skull room door is this old man who is sort of strung up, sort of in like a test tube flotation tank situation. And it appears that whatever weird magic-y sort of stuff is happening is being fed by something about this old man.
That is to say that you find out you are that old man. All of the servants in the building, as well as the head servant with the gold mask, are all you. You are tormenting yourself. You are doing this to yourself. You are forcing yourself to relive day after day and both torment these personas of the former members of this casino manor, as well as you, the primary host, because of something you did. You are Lafcadio Boone, you are the Marquis, and you constructed this mental prison to atone for something that you did, and you find out what you did was you burned down the manor for insurance money and ended up murdering everybody in it, including your pregnant wife, who is Eleanor. Yes, Eleanor, who is the red woman spirit who has been haunting you and wanting you to figure out what's going on, wanting you to free everybody and free yourself from this repeating time prison.
And what I really enjoyed about the end is that they put the gold mask head servant you in contrast to Eleanor, Bloody Lady. So you sort of have the angel and the devil, and the head servant, gold mask servant, is trying to convince you that you're an awful person and you deserve to relive these horrible things over and over and over again. And Eleanor wants you to forgive yourself and move on. And it's really interesting dynamic, because you would think that your pregnant wife who you killed because of a harebrained plot to get insurance money, you wouldn't necessarily expect her to be so committed to having you forgive yourself. Mm-hmm. But I think that that's a really nice sort of twist on this damsel in distress, because I always got the impression that the Bloody Lady was like your love, and she is.
Once you learn who Eleanor is, it seems pretty clear she's probably Eleanor.
But you don't know what's trippy about it is that at one point after you have figured out you're in this sort of unending reality of death and murder, and you go out into the garden, you realize that everything's burning. Mm-hmm. And you go to this house. And Eleanor,
this adorable little cottage outside of the grounds of the manor.
And Eleanor, as a normal, not bloody, living person, appears to be living person, is in the house preparing for your child. And it certainly gives the impression that whatever happened didn't reach Eleanor. Maybe you protected something mm-hmm. protected Eleanor. And so it's pretty sort of twisty, jarring to be like, oh, no, Eleanor is dead. Like, just like everybody else.
Right. And they make you flip through it several times until you realize, oh, this is just a figment as well. It's kind of a repeating door kind of thing where you like walk through and you're like, oh, I'm here. You walk through, it's like, oh, I'm here, but it's different now. And it kind of goes through those different steps as you go through it. Moving on to just kind of the morality of this, I'm a little torn on how I feel about Boone, Lafcadio, and this scenario that they're in. It's a moral dilemma, and I think it's trying to set itself up as one in which he's clearly been literally tormenting himself with a hellish scenario for, based on what they say, decades. He's an older man now. He was probably in his 30s or so when all this happened, and now he's, a gray-haired older man, at least in his 50s or 60s. They don't specify. And he put himself into this kind of eternal torment that was literally beyond the pale of anything that could happen in a real-world scenario. And then at the end, you do have the option. We chose to forgive ourselves, I think, really to try and get the good ending. I'm not sure if something happens differently if you choose the one where you just choose to go back through it, or if something happens with that. But we chose the one where it's like, let's shut it all off and go on with our lives. But it's a tricky thing to say, because it's like, having never murdered, 9 of my dearest friends and wife, I don't know how you get around to being like, okay, I'm okay with myself now. At what point does that happen? And I think this kind of sets up that question, but I don't know if it really gives you enough to answer that, because it's such a late game reveal that you realize you are the one who caused all this.
And you don't have a ton of context for the relationship the Marquis had to these characters unless you go and read the character bios in the menu. And I think you already mentioned it when we were dealing with the fish thing, which was super frustrating. That there were no in-game hints, right? It was in the menu. Like, you had to go look. And I feel a little bit the same way about the relationship of the Marquis to the characters, that you really don't get a super rounded sense of how the Marquis interacted with each person until you go into their character bio and you read it. And I enjoyed that. I enjoyed reading the little character bios and, learning more information. But it doesn't, I think if you're not someone who's going to go do that, you're not going to maybe feel the full impact of what the developers wanted you to feel.
Yeah, I think there are some things in game that do give you those hints to it. For instance, when you do save each individual character, you talk to them just as like person to person. And they realize that you have saved them. They realize that you are Boone. And they kind of have a brief moment with you. And it's always kind of a relief to see you. They are still your friends. They lend you their power. They kind of give you that tacit agreement of like, figure out what the hell's going on here and end it. And so I think there is, like, you are on a positive relationship with all of these people, and based on what your background probably was, you were close with them. And so I definitely got that, but you didn't get any sort of, like, extensive background on them. Additionally, some of the rooms in the manor, you can get a little bit more of a feel for maybe what Boone was like. I know down on the basement levels, there were certain rooms that seemed very homey and just had kind of these different portraits of potential family members with just like little bits of comments here and there. And I thought that did give a little bit more context. It wasn't the deepest or necessarily the most original context for who Lafcadio Boone was before he decided to make this big old manor, but it was something, and it was there in the environment, and you just kind of passed through it.
You know that Lafcadio is seen as a mentor, but you have no idea. That's the kind of thing that I wish was in game, is that like Lafcadio is a priest who is a mentor to Lucas, who's the Marquis.
And they do give you a few hints on that, where when both the Red Woman and the Eleanor figure, when you meet her, both talk about how Lafcadio looks up to you, the Marquis looks up, or excuse me, not Lafcadio, the Marquis looks up to you, you are Lafcadio Boone, you don't realize those are the same person right from the bat, but it's just kind of there, where it's like the mixed up identity is both obvious, but they don't just come out and say it.
Well, and if you go in and read Lafcadio Boone's info, you learn that Lafcadio Boone was a person who is not the Marquis, but that the Marquis imagined himself as Lafcadio Boone in this retelling. And I feel like that's the kind of thing that knowing that gives this story and gives the decision more impact, but you just don't, it's not easy to find. You have to go looking for that information. And while I like that you do find out things if you are looking, that kind of thing feels like we should have known that from something in game. We should have known that Lucas imagined himself as Lafcadio. The Marquis imagined himself this way because this friend and mentor was so important to him.
Well, now I'm now looking at this and looking at these bios again. I am honestly a little confused on this. Was in the real world, was Lafcadio Boone a separate person from Lucas Bondus, who was the Marquis?
Yes.
Oh, okay. And then when he imprisoned himself, he saw himself as Lafcadio.
Because Lafcadio was a gambler and a casino person, just like Lucas was. But Lafcadio renounced his ways. I think maybe became a priest. That's why he got
that's what it says right there.
Right. So, but that's a separate, distinct, in the real world.
Okay.
A separate person.
From Lucas the Marquis.
From Lucas. Lucas the Marquis is person A. And Lafcadio Boone is person B. And person A, the Marquis, knew person B, Boone, in real life. And that was a mentor-mentee relationship. But what, like, that gets so obscured in this game.
Right.
That I just thought that was how Lucas would look now.
Mm-hmm.
But
that's what I was thinking too. And I was seeing this is him now. So he inserted his older man self into the past. He changed his name to Lafcadio Boone. He became a priest, and in the process of that has become repentant and tormenting himself this way. But I think he's just putting himself in the shoes of that. But they don't, like, for as explicit as this game gets at certain times, there are a few things where you're just like, why didn't you just explain that part? And this is something I looked up when I was looking up just some information on the developers and all that. They wanted to make sure they had a concrete ending with this game. They didn't want to leave it up to just your interpretation. They wanted to kind of literally say, hey, you did this, you caused this has all been in your head, and now you are releasing yourself from it to live the rest of your life with having atoned for your sins. They are very explicit in the interview I've seen, and they've only done a couple just as the developer, but that is something that they really wanted to put out there. And so seeing that statement, having a pretty clear picture in my head, and now is completely thrown off by just rereading this and going like, oh wait, I always thought Lucas turned into Lafcadio, but that's not the case at all. He was imagining himself as Lafcadio and all that, and that's why they actually talk about them as two separate people.
I think that is the biggest weakness of this game, is that for as explicit as it can get, there are elements, whether it is a puzzle or information about characters, that they just leave it a little too vague, or they make you go find it when it's not required. We had this whole thing where we thought we had to go find the invitations for everybody. Guess what? Turned out invitations were a collectible, but the way that they sort of present that piece of it to you, you're like, oh, well, I need to go get everyone's invitation. So like, we got everyone's invitation, and then nothing happened. And so we like Googled it, and they're like, oh, invitations are collectibles.
Just walk up to the spot and this thing will trigger. And it's a fairly linear game until you hit that point where they just kind of let you explore the manor freely throughout the day and find these collectibles or do whatever you want. But they don't necessarily make it clear that that's what's going on, and that it's like, oh, to head to the end game, go right here. So I think that was one of those issues that we had with that, and just kind of walking that right line of being explicit about some stuff and being open to interpretation, open to the gameplay decided by the player. And it's a tough line to walk, and I think for the most part they created a really good experience, but there were just those frustrating moments like you have with just about any game. Moving on from all this, I want to kind of get to some of our final thoughts on here, because I know we're going to be discussing this a lot more in depth next week as we pair these two together, especially since, we haven't gotten to the other half. These things have so much in common. So much. Now, having gone through both, just so many things in common.
We'll get there.
I know. What is your final takeaway from this game? What did it elicit from you? What are you going to take to the next kind of game you play? And what would you want to see from these developers in the future?
I really like the way that this game presents mystery. I think there are a lot of games in which either death or some sort of, big sort of traditional mystery is the driving focus. And what I really enjoyed is that you solve a number of mysteries, you get this information, and it leads you to sort of this big picture, behind the scenes, unexpected twist. And I think this game did it really well. Even with the sort of flaws and gaps in communication, in general, my experience playing this game was really positive. It helps that I found it to be a beautiful game. It just visually, I loved it. I loved the characters. I loved the just opulence, and just the environment was so well done that I think I was more committed and more engaged than maybe some other sort of adventure games, because I just really, really enjoyed this setting. And I would love to see this same treatment getting really the reliving I enjoyed, as stressful as that could be. I think I had a more appreciation for the game, the characters, and the environment because we went through it so many times, and because we had to go through it, over and over and over again. So I'd love to see that same treatment, but in a totally different setting. Maybe it's still some murder mystery situation, but in a, I don't know, tropical beach or ski mountain chalet or, I don't know, some other just totally different setting, I think would be really awesome.
I really enjoyed this game as well. I would highly recommend it. I know I did during the intro to anybody who has, 8 to 10 hours to play a intriguing puzzle game with a solid story to it that isn't the greatest ever, but certainly puts forth a lot of neat aspects and some interesting mechanics. I would love to see more in this. You don't even modify time, really. It's all about finding the right timing and learning the movements throughout a enclosed space. And I think it's honestly similar to some of the things that may come up and why people like the new series of Hitman games, where you are kind of dropped into a large confined area, a portion of a city or whatever the level is, and it's all about finding the different opportunities available to you that move on a regular pace around those individual levels. And I think there's a lot of interest in that, where people want real time in a game, but they want to be able to relive it and not have it be too long, and they don't want to miss too many things, because I think that's how people are programmed to enjoy games. They want to be able to enjoy it entirely. And I think this does a good job of everything makes logical sense, where each person moves from and to, and what they do is consistent throughout. You can easily track them as you get through the whole game, and you can see it illustrated on the map of exactly where they go as you get that information. And I think that's a really cool aspect to solving the puzzles.
And in the current murder you're trying to solve, they put the little masks on your pocket watch in the time that they're going to die. So you watch, you get closer, and it actually is really helpful to figure out, I know that I need to wait until X time. Okay, how much time do I have between then and now? And how much time after the death do I have? That was an element that I wasn't expecting, but that turned out to be really useful.
Yeah, and I think they give the right amount of UI to manage what they're asking of you with the map, the pocket watch, the everything, the sound effects in the distance, where you can hear or see a sign from each major murder that happens, whether it be you hear a gunshot and you hear it in any part of the house, or the electricity flares because somebody gets two people get electrocuted to death. 2, 1, there's a big electrical shock. It's one of the murders that involves 2 people. The bell ringing, all that different kind of stuff.
The glass shattering.
The announcement that the show will begin at whatever time. It's all there, and it's all consistent. Even before you solve that murder and after you solve that murder, it gives those same announcements. It gives those same triggers because they're still happening and repeating. And it really makes it a cohesive, you sink into this timeline, and I think it's really great. I would love to see them do a similar puzzle type. I don't know what they could do with this, because the way the puzzles work tied so well in with the story, and you can't just repeat that story. So I think from the studio, I want to see some interesting new gameplay mechanic. I think they have a pretty good eye for puzzles. I think with a little bit more refinement on a couple of them, they can make some really cool new puzzle games, and I would love to see that from a great indie developer that can make it fun, engaging, give it a good story to go along with it, so they're not just abstract puzzles to solve, say, like a Professor Layton game.
Once I was in your arms, crushing grip of steel. Once you had all my heart. Lord knows where that is now. Now I see through you, as though you're made of glass.
Well, I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think that was a really good way to end the episode. I think Switching gears, let's talk about our book of this pairing, The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. Peter.
Yeah.
Start us off. What did you think of this book?
This is a book. I'm still refining my thoughts on this book in kind of a review sense. I initially, if I'm just going based on like star ratings or whatever, I was kind of like, it feels like a 4 out of 5. I enjoyed that. I thought it was pretty good. Looking back on it, I might move it more down to kind of more of a 3, a little bit more average in my own view, because I don't know if it holds up to as much scrutiny as I would like it to. It's definitely a interesting book when you get through it the first time and you're like, oh wow, those are some good twists. That was a interesting mystery he built there. But then thinking back on certain aspects of it, I don't know if it held up entirely to my initial thought on that.
Let's talk plot so that we sort of have the context for this.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on that right at the beginning there. You can't just, drop me in with that.
When I first read this book, I really enjoyed it. I was surprised at the twists. I was interested and engaged in the whole book. I was not expecting the ending that it was, but I liked the ending.
It's definitely a bit of an out there ending.
So overall, I'm very pro this book. I think I might have given it a 4. For me, reading experience is really important. Like not just the quality of the book, but the experience I have while I'm reading it. And this was a book that I just wanted to keep reading. I couldn't speed through it because it is complicated, and we'll get into all the layers that go into it.
It's complicated and a bit longer than you would expect it to be.
Exactly. But my experience of reading it was such that I found myself picking it up just so I could read a few pages. Even if I just had 10 minutes, let me go read a little chunk of Evelyn Hardcastle, which to me is a mark of a good book.
Going off of that, a quick plot summary of this book. You wake up, you're in a forest. All you can say is the name Anna. You've got this weird pocket watch. You're pretty certain Anna's been murdered, and you are running through the woods. You soon find that you're at this large mansion, and there's kind of this party going on. There's kind of a weekend party type deal where it's lots of ritzy folks in there to have I guess this is what rich people do in aristocratic England, where you're like, oh, let's go and hang out in the mansion for several days. And I guess that's something, any elite group can do.
They were going to have a ball, a masquerade ball.
True. And I guess it was specifically for the return of Evelyn Hardcastle from being in Paris for the past almost 20 years.
I think, was it Paris?
Mm-hmm. It was 19 years in Paris.
That's right.
Kind of on a semi-self-imposed / family-imposed exile from her childhood to her now later 20s. And she has returned, and they're having kind of this... It's a bit of a coming-out party, as it were. And what you find is that at the end of that night, Evelyn Hardcastle is murdered. You're not sure by who. And as you fall asleep, get knocked out, whatever happens to you, the next time you wake up, you're in a different person's body, reliving the exact same day you just went through.
I loved this element when I realized what the hell was going on. Mm-hmm. This was something that was so interesting to me. And I love that the whole deal is it's one day.
Yes.
And when you go unconscious, you switch bodies. And it only goes until that last body wakes up, which is fascinating. So there's one character.
Well, going back, I want to make sure we establish the rules with this. Is that, yes, so your day goes from whenever that person you're in wakes up till when they fall asleep, are incapacitated, or killed. And then if you fall asleep in the middle or get knocked out in the middle and they come back to later, you will sometimes switch bodies in and out to different people. And that makes for some interesting mechanics. You only get to go through each person once. The goal of the character, who we find out his name is Aidan Bishop, his real name, is to figure out who killed Evelyn Hardcastle with enough evidence, and he needs to tell it to the Plague Doctor character, who kind of comes in as this cosmic referee who kind of steps in. He puts his thumb on the scale sometimes. He points Aidan in the right direction or in a direction, and he is there to adjudicate whether or not Aidan has successfully figured out who murdered Evelyn, and if he is able to be freed from Blackheath Manor and go back to whatever he's from. It's a little unclear.
One of the twists in this story is that Blackheath Manor is not real. Well,
it is real.
Blackheath Manor in this situation has some supernatural shit happening.
Much like the Sexy Brutale, it existed at one point, but probably doesn't anymore, and you are trapped in a version of it from a particular period, reliving the same day over and over again.
Yes.
Not going any further into the similarities. I was just saying, this is one of the points in which they are very similar. I'm leaving it at that for now.
Peter is very excited
That's
for
where
next
you're
week's
at.
episode. So you relive this day, and you have 8 host bodies that you're cycling through.
Mm-hmm.
And like Peter said, every time a body falls asleep, is incapacitated, or killed, you wake up in the next host. And what I found really interesting is that each host, so Aidan is our main character. Aidan is the one
The consciousness.
Aidan is our main consciousness. Aidan is the one who's trying to figure out who killed Evelyn, have the proof. We get his perspective. But what I found really interesting about each host is that they have differing levels of control over Aidan's consciousness.
Well, and specifically, the ones coming at the later end of his cycle have more control because his just mind is getting exhausted from being in all these different bodies.
So one of the characters is Lord Ravencourt.
Yes, he's the third one he fully, goes through.
And he is this sort of slovenly old man.
He's an old rich man. He's about 60, and his main characteristic, which I have a few qualms about, is thus that he's incredibly fat.
Yes.
Yeah, that's his whole thing.
And is supposed to, Evelyn is supposed to marry him.
Yes, we do find that out, that there is kind of an arranged marriage going on between Evelyn, a later 20s woman of means, and this about 60-year-old man who is a friend of her parents.
But what's interesting about Aidan's consciousness in Ravencourt is that Ravencourt is easily exhausted. Again, there's some fat-phobic body-shaming issues happening with this character. But putting a pin in that, Ravencourt's, the exhaustion is a really big piece. And Aidan's consciousness, when he's in Ravencourt, can't break out of that. Like, he feels that exhaustion. He feels that tiredness. I think Ravencourt takes the most naps out of all of the hosts.
Well, that's Aidan trying to game the system. So Ravencourt, I don't believe, is actually prone to taking naps. However, that is, since it comes earlier in the thing, and Aidan, not entirely sure what's going on, trying to game the system, trying to see what other bodies he will go into, forces Ravencourt to fall asleep to see what he goes into. And he gets called out on it almost right away by the Plague Doctor, who kind of like tuts him and go, no, don't do that.
So that's one sort of example of the host having control over Aidan. But where you really see this struggle is with Jonathan Derby, who is just like a trash person. He is a trash person.
Well, yeah, no, he is. And I was going to say more specifically, they say he is both an abuser and assaulter of women.
Yeah, he is a terrible man. He treats women horrifically.
Literally commits crimes against them and has them covered up by his wealthy family.
And so when Aiden is in Jonathan Derby's body, he talks about the pull that Derby is having on his actions and on his thoughts even. I think there's one point where Aiden feels like these hatred towards women, where he's like, I don't hate women, but Derby's self is so strong that and Aiden is getting weaker because Derby is a little bit later on in the host progression, that it's just like you really get a sense that Aiden is not just occupying these sort of empty shells of bodies. And I think that throws sort of a wrench into this idea of, oh, you're just occupying different people, you get different perspectives, you get different access to information. But it's like, yes, you get all those things, but on the flip side, you have to deal with the actual desires and physicality and emotions of your host bodies.
And that is one of those things that Aiden does use to his advantage throughout the story once he realizes what's going on. And it's hinted at initially during Raven Court, where he does some very conniving things to get his valet to do some sneaky stuff for him. And the valet points out, like, oh, that's a very Raven Court-like mood, because he comes forward and tells the valet, hey, I'm not actually Raven Court. I'm stuck in this weird scenario. This is what's going to happen. But he still kind of brings out that kind of conniving power play system. When he inhabits the butler of the house, he has these instincts to say, yes, sir, no, sir, to be like polite while also chastising the maids who work there for if they're being sloppy or not doing what they're supposed to. And by the end, he's able to access memories of the host he's in. He remembers a lot of things from the constable, who is his second to last host, and he remembers a lot of things from Gold, who is his last host, who is an artist who's in the mansion helping touch up the artwork. All that is to say, it's an interesting plot device in that it both allows for Turton to kind of explore these different characters through the same consciousness, while also giving us access to new information by going to these different characters without necessarily introducing new players to the mix. They are all the same person, even though they're all technically different people, and it's kind of a nice way of drawing that line of, here's my cast of characters, even though these 7 are actually all the same guy with slight variations.
And not all of the characters are hosts. And in fact, we learn that 2 of the other people in the manor are players.
Yes.
We'll call them players.
I think they describe them more as competitors.
Competitors, players. Basically, we learn that there are 2 other people in this weird world situation that are also tasked with figuring out who killed Evelyn and bringing the plague doctor proof. One we learn is Anna, who is this person that Bishop had this name of stuck in his head from the very beginning. And the other inhabits Daniel, but he's only ever Daniel. And Anna inhabits one of the maids, and she's only ever the maid.
Right, and that's a couple of the early twists when you learn that Anna is the maid, because he's looking for this Anna character. Nobody in the manor knows who Anna is, and Anna finds him and goes, I'm Anna. I'm actually this person right now. Stop asking for Anna. It's throwing everything off.
Cool your jet.
Yeah, well, and the second one is that Daniel Coleridge, the gambler, is described as being one of his future hosts. So Daniel comes to him as Ravencourt and is like, hey, I'm you 6 days from now. I'm the last one. I'm putting the final touches on my plan. Everything's going to be great. And he is also made to believe that the footman is the additional player in this scenario. And the footman is in the guise of a servant, but is actually a murderous, crazy person who's trying to come after all his hosts and kill them in brutal ways. The trick it ends up being that the footman is just a person being managed by Coleridge, Daniel Coleridge, and Daniel Coleridge is actually a separate player entirely who only ever lives as Daniel Coleridge and is working against Aiden and Anna the entire time.
When we said this is complicated, there are so many pieces that fall into place / are revealed that I'm not a big rereader, but this is one that I think I want to revisit in a little bit to read again and see, because there are these layers like Daniel, the whole con. Daniel is good. He's like, yeah, I'm a future host. Yeah, the footman, you got to watch out for him. Like, it just is so well done that I didn't expect that was going to be the other player. I was fooled. That's for sure. And I think that's one of the strengths of Turton's writing, is that he has put all these layers in place in these relationships, and he does a good job of sort of throwing the scent around in a way that you don't realize you're being duped until you learn you're being duped. I thought that was a really clever way to introduce different aspects of the characters, of this sort of, there are multiple competitors. Who is who? You don't really know. It takes a while to really figure out who are the actual key players in this story. Who's really trying to figure out what happened, and who is friendly and who is not.
In a fashion very similar to the Sexy Brutale.
Peter, we have a whole episode on this next week.
Blackheath Manor is a large structure designed to host dozens of people at a time, and really it is an enormous place based on the number of people they list, the ones they don't end up listing but are clearly there, and just the sheer number of bedrooms that would take up. Also the fact that they mentioned specifically not every bedroom is full. This place is enormous.
Plus, it sits on massive ground.
Yes, acres and acres of land, miles of land, it seems, because at one point, one of Aiden's hosts attempts to drive away to get into town. This is early on when he's like, I gotta go get the cops involved on this. And he tries to drive away. And it might be a little bit of magic, it might be a little bit of something else, but he's not able to make it into town before gas runs out of the car. And then he starts walking and he gets lost somewhere in the woods along the way. So it's clearly designed as kind of this large palatial country estate, and that's where we are. It's also set up as a dilapidated environment, and that is because it has not been kept up by the family that owns it, the Hardcastle family, because 19 years prior to this, there had been a murder of one of their children at the site.
And Helena is the mother, is Mama Hardcastle. And
Yes.
Peter is not this Peter, of course.
Peter Hardcastle.
Peter Hardcastle is Papa Hardcastle. And they have Evelyn, Thomas, who's Evelyn's brother, and Michael. Michael was the child that was killed in the woods 19 years prior. And you definitely get the sense that was a super traumatic experience, as the death of a child / sibling probably would be. And so the Hardcastles sort of fled and neglected Blackheath Manor because it was just so painful. Yet, this coming out reunion celebration party happens. Is it either right around or on the anniversary of Michael's death? So this is a very sort of pivotal experience.
And on top of that, everyone who's invited was previously at the manor when all of this occurred. So I guess it was a similar type of big party weekend when Michael was murdered 19 years prior. And now everyone who's there is re-invited. And presumably some of the younger members of the family who were there, because there are some young adults and it's a little unclear if they were there or not, or maybe they were just children or what. But they're all the same group there, and they really kind of set this up as, oh, this is going to be in direct response to what happened to Michael 19 years prior. And what you end up finding out is that it's related, but not necessarily in the way you might think. Nobody's going for revenge. Nobody's specifically doing anything except for, I guess, are we going to get to the end here?
Let's do it.
Except you find out that actually Evelyn is the one behind all of it, but not the Evelyn you think you know.
No, the real Evelyn Hardcastle, is a sociopath who abandoned a poor, like, stable boy
Yes.
in a cave,
That's the first person she killed.
left him to die.
Yep, let
Cool,
him
cool,
starve
cool.
to death.
And then killed her brother. Like, that is what happened.
Yes.
She killed her brother.
Actively created a plan to murder her brother. Her mother found her brother dying. Basically was helping cover for Evelyn. Ended up framing Evelyn's biological father, her illegitimate father, for the murder. It gets all twisty-turny. There's this, like, 7 twists into the book.
I mean, truly, you think you know what's going on. There's a twist. You're like, okay, oh, now I know what's going on. And there's another twist. And it feels like it goes on like that for the, like, entire second half of the book, where you're like, okay, I got a handle. It's the host. You got Bishop and Anna and Daniel. Okay, we're trying to figure out what's going on. And then it's like, wait, Helena killed her son? Wait.
The guy who went to death for killing her son was actually the boy's father and the father of all the children.
Actually, there's another illegitimate son who wasn't claimed as a Hardcastle, who is involved in this situation. There are just so many pieces of the puzzle that this is why I want to reread it. Because it's like, now that I know it, it just is so many things to hold at one time.
Right. The issue with rereading this book, I think, and having just gone through it, I don't know if there's always those breadcrumbs there. There's a lot of fun twists to this, and that's why I initially was like, oh, this is a really good story. Lots of fun twists. Cool structure as far as just like, oh, this happened, then this happened. It all makes enough sense in your head. But there were several times in which there were kind of unseen, they felt like Deus Ex Machinas, but then they kind of explained it away, be like, oh, I did this. They just didn't describe it in the book. And so there were a couple times where there were a posse who kind of came together at Aiden's request to stop the footmen, to come up with this. You don't see that scene happening where he actually gets them together and makes it happen, because it ends up getting paced more like an exciting TV show than a book where you expect to see some of the things actually happening. And I don't know if all those twists and turns are going to be there. Also, he's actively changing the time stream as he goes through the new days, because once he realizes he can have effects on things, he starts changing it. And since you don't go back and relive those days after he's changed it, it can be hard to actually track with the time stream switches he makes.
I think you're totally right. And maybe that's part of my desire to reread, is see if those breadcrumbs exist.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest piece that I would be incredibly surprised if there were breadcrumbs is sort of the biggest reveal of the whole book, which is that
Evelyn's been in disguise the whole time?
No.
Oh, what do you consider to be the biggest reveal?
To me, the biggest reveal is that...
Well, can I go over the Evelyn one since it's not the biggest reveal?
Let's do Evelyn.
So Evelyn was the one behind all these murders. She's been killing people all weekend. She killed both her parents, killed the Anna, the fake Anna as well, and is just kind of behind all this nonsense going on. So the big twist with that is that real Evelyn... Oh, excuse me, I said Anna instead of Evelyn. Real Evelyn is in disguise as a French maid, and then the Evelyn everyone's actually calling Evelyn and talking to is a friend of hers named Felicity, or this woman that she hired to impersonate her for this weekend. And so the Evelyn you see die 7.5 times or whatever is actually Felicity, and so that is the first murder solved by this whole case. It's this big topsy-turvy twisty-turny, same diff, case where you think you're solving Evelyn's murder, you're actually solving Felicity's murder, and realizing that it was actually Evelyn who did all of the murders, pretty much.
Evelyn is a sociopath.
Yes, and that's kind of the final twist, is that she's just crazy and likes murdering people, which, as far as twist goes, isn't as interesting as all the hidden identities. Like, whatever her I guess I don't know what kind of other motive you could build in that scenario, but it just felt a little hollow at the end. It was like, oh, she's just a crazy person? Okay.
I do feel like I wanted there to be some rationale. Like, this was all a ploy to continue to cover up Michael's death. And she wasn't a sociopath. She was just trying to preserve this illusion that it was Carver, who's the guy who went to death, the gallows for murdering Michael, even though he didn't really do it. And that would have been, to me, a much more interesting reveal, is that, oh, this is not really Evelyn. This is this woman, Felicity. Evelyn's the French maid.
Right.
But Evelyn's doing all of this because there's still, maybe with Carver dead, there's some in the blackmailer, like there's a lot of other things going on, so maybe it's this ploy. But it does turn out to just be like, oh, Evelyn likes killing people. Evelyn's a nutter. Like, it feels like there should be more rationale.
And I think the rationale behind it would be that she would then inherit all of her family's money and be able to just go do whatever she wants. Great. But just realizing now this potential, like, plot issue, if she kills the woman impersonating Evelyn Hardcastle in plain view of everyone, because that's how it is. Evelyn Hardcastle kills herself and is coerced into doing it.
On the front lawn.
Yeah, during the masquerade. Everyone sees her die. And at that same weekend, both the Hardcastle parents die, as well as Evelyn's brother through a kind of accidental drinking of poison that actually killed the fake Evelyn. If that entire family just suddenly died, if this maid then tries to pop up and be like, actually, I'm Evelyn Hardcastle, as I guess would be her plan, how is she going to get the money from doing all this? It's like, okay, you succeeded. You killed your entire family and everyone thinks you're dead. How do you get these assets at that point?
Right. Where do you go from here?
Right. So, like, she would need at least her brother to still be alive. And I think that was her initial plan, and her brother was kind of the accidental death. But it was just one of those things where it's just like, oh yeah, I guess that doesn't make a lot of sense. If the entire Hardcastle, even if Evelyn didn't make it look like she killed herself, if her parents just wind up dead, the finger might get pointed at her. And it's just like, it feels like, man, you really didn't think through this long-term plan to murder your family. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm like, I don't know if it holds up under deeper scrutiny. Maybe an even deeper scrutiny actually makes it better, but I haven't seen it so far. But getting now to, I would say, the meta twist. Aaron, can you talk about the meta, the final twist of this book, the biggest thing that sets it all up?
Okay. Blackheath Manor is some weird psychological, maybe purgatory type prison situation. Anna and Daniel are actually criminals, and they are put in this situation to, like, atone for their crimes, and it's basically impossible for them to escape. That's the whole thing. That's this plague doctor, when he sort of puts the thumb on the scale, like, it's not supposed to be something Daniel and Anna can solve. This is one twist. The second part of the big twist is that Aidan Bishop willingly went into this world because Anna was actually, in Aidan's reality, a terrorist who killed Aidan's sister. And so Aidan goes into her world to try and torment her, but ends up sort of like becoming best friends and allies, and like loves her, not maybe romantically, but like has deep affection for her.
The development is, after presumed decades of seeking out this woman and killing her numerous times over as, some sort of like monstrous punishment, he believes she has changed and atoned and wouldn't be inclined to do the things she did however many decades ago. Because they really kind of implied that they've been going through this same daily loop hundreds, thousands of times.
This is not the This is not the first time Aidan Bishop has done the loop.
Right. Well, yeah. No, they get to that pretty early on, where it's like, clearly he's done this before, and then about halfway through, and it kind of reveals like, I feel like we've been doing this for decades. It's been forever. And so it's just this weird thing where you're kind of setting up, what are the parameters of this now? Like the game they're in has fairly well-defined rules, but what are the actual rules of this reality? Is this a supernatural thing? Is this some sort of like Matrix-y type thing where they've got like something plugged into their brainstem? Or is it an actual like heaven-hell scenario? Are they actually in the afterlife? How is Aiden able to track down and figure out how to get into the Blackheath scenario?
And none of it is explained.
No. At the end, they just kind of walk off together, deciding to be like, hey, we figured it out. We're going to go live our lives and not be stuck in Blackheath because that place sucks.
This is one of my issues with having, 7 different twists in a story, is that it, at some point, it stops being rational, and you can't really justify any of it, in that like it doesn't hold up when you look at this line and you're like, okay, what happens next? It totally falls apart when you have so many twists upon twists.
Right.
And I think reflecting back, I loved the reading experience. I really enjoyed it. I was engaged, but when you start to pull on the thread, it unravels. You can't follow it down, and you can't look back and see how you got there for all of the twists. You can for some, but for others, you're just sort of left scratching your head.
Right, and I think it is Turton really tries to put a lot of logical rules onto what is inherently an illogical scenario that I feel it almost feels like he kind of wants it both ways, where he wants it to be mysterious and magical, but also have some really concrete things that are occurring and build that kind of strict timeline. And I feel like it's kind of a have your cake, eat it too type scenario, where it's like, if you want the more magical element, you're going to have to lean into that. But I feel like you're leaning a little too heavily into like the structured and rules so that we can all piece together the intense mystery you put together. And I would say that's just one of, I think, the shortcomings of it. It's not a huge one, and it's still very easy to enjoy this book. I think it could be an interesting adaptation in the future to maybe something like a mini-series. It's an interesting story. It's got a lot of cool twists and some interesting characters, but it just can't pick a lane of like, do I want to be more magical? Do I want to be more hard mystery with strict rules? And it just is like a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it just kind of makes it unsatisfying in either direction.
It is worth noting that this is Turton's first novel, and he's writing a second one. It's due to be out next year. So I am interested in what this second novel is going to be, and if it's going to have some of those similar elements to Evelyn Hardcastle, or if it's something radically different. And I think if it's something radically different, to me, that sort of is an indication that he is realizing that the straddling of genre lanes, or just like literary convention lanes, isn't the most successful tactic. It makes for an exciting story, but it just doesn't have the depth that I was really looking for when I think back on the narrative and the plot as a whole. Now that we have discussed the many twists, plots, potential holes,
the 7.5 holes and plot twists of Evelyn Hardcastle,
what are your final thoughts, Peter?
My final thoughts are, this book has a lot of good stuff going for it. I think it's a really interesting story. It's an interesting mystery. It's an interesting timeline that Turton builds. But I think there were a couple decisions that should have been made a bit more strictly on certain things. And I think there was maybe some more nuance to be explored about to set it into this kind of like weird external world and then not explore it at all which you don't have to, but it's just one of those things where it's like if something gets teased right at the end and you're like, and it's all in the normal world, it just feels like, so was all this just kind of pointless? It was all just kind of in their heads. Obviously, something's going on, and it happens in certain pieces of fiction sometimes where it's like the more interesting story is the twist at the end where you're just like, you should just made the whole thing about that. That's way cooler. I want to know about these weird ass mind prisons and not just have, 17 hours of audiobook just being in one of them without ever hinting that there's more. Like that, I think that's where it kind of gets at, where it's like, these are two cool concepts, the time traveling one and the mind prison one. And I think smushing them together doesn't give you enough time to do either one effectively, at least in my opinion on that. I still think it's a good book. I think it's worth a read, worth a listen. I think it gets a little long in the tooth on some of the stuff, and I feel like you could have had a similarly good story in a slightly more concise telling of it. And I didn't feel like I got a lot of extra dimension from some of that extra time spent on describing things or talking about how fat and gross he feels inside Ravencourt. And it was that's why I'm just kind of on the edge with this. I don't regret going through it, but I don't know if I'm going to actively recommend it to people unless they don't know what the twist is and they're just looking for a book with some really cool twists.
I think this is a book that the less you know, the better, because part of what made reading it so exciting for me was that I had no clue what the story was going into it, and so everything surprised me and was interesting, and I didn't predict the twists, and I didn't know what was coming. And I think that's the best way to read this book if you're going to read it. I think if you read a lot of murder mysteries, this is one to consider. It's a different take on a murder mystery, and I think it's unique enough that if that's really your thing, if you really love that investigation-y murder piece, this is one to look at. There are certainly issues with the way some of the characters are described. There are some issues with those plot holes. But overall, I think it's a good book. I'm interested in what the second book from Turton is going to be. He mentioned in an interview that it's not another Evelyn Hardcastle. It's going to be different with some shared elements. So I will have my eyes out for the new book, just because I enjoyed Evelyn Hardcastle. I'd like to see what Turton does next.
Yeah, I'm definitely in agreement with that. I don't think he's a bad author by any stretch. It's just one of those. It's his first book. There's different stuff. I've got complex thoughts on anything, and I'm still working on my critical voice for how to come at books with some of this, to both express enjoying the experience, but maybe not calling it a critical success in every facet. So that's why I'm like between a 3 and a 4 is where I'm landing. Probably a 3.5 is my most accurate star rating if you really are tied to what I think in numbers of a book. But yeah, no, that's all I got on that one.
That is all we have for our deep dive discussion on the Sexy Brutale and the 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. Next week is our pairing discussion episode, so we will be talking about all the ways that these two pieces of entertainment fit together. Peter is very excited, obviously, since he couldn't wait and hold it back.
There's just so much in common, and if that's not clear from this discussion yet, it will be very abundantly clear next week when I just list like directly in a line like they both did this, they both did this, they both did this. But we'll get there. But you can find all of our posts about this, all of our episodes and everything. We have our SoundCloud page and we have our WordPress blog, which is gameandread.wordpress.com.
You can also find us on social media. I am over on Instagram at A Tale of Two Shelves.
Yes, my Twitter is at NerdInTheWorld. You can also follow this podcast on all the major podcasts. We're on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher. And
I think they call it Apple Podcasts now.
Apple Podcasts, but also that's the feed that I think most third-party podcast catchers go to. So I use Downcast, and I'm pretty sure it comes from that. So anything you're using, unless it's some weird additional one I've never heard of, should be on there. And if it's not on there, let us know and we'll get it submitted.
Our intro music was written and performed by Avery Murchison, and you can find a link to his Bandcamp in the description below.
Thanks for listening.
And we'll see you next time.
Game and read.
As you creak off into the distance. Dang.
I'm an old door. Forgot to tell you.
I will spray you with so much WD-40.